Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 765, and it is titled The Life of Francis of Assisi, and it is written by Henry C. Vedder. I believe the copyright is 1923. Let me look here. Yes, nope, copyright 1925. And we'll begin with chapter 1, and it is called The Church and the Age, Life of Francis Assisi. Study of the medieval world has a curious fascination for our age, the more so, perhaps, because such study is beset with difficulties, many and great. It is a world so unlike our own, that to think ourselves back into it, so as to realize in some measure what it meant to those who lived in it, is an enterprise promising much pleasure and profit, if it does also threaten much effort and possible failure. The medieval world had two great institutions that conditioned all life, and we must gain some comprehension of these at the outset of our quest, or all our research will fail to lead us into the heart of things. These two institutions were the papacy and the empire. Some would doubtless describe these two institutions as the Church and the Empire. The difference is merely verbal, not material, for the Church was the papacy, and the papacy was the Church. Whatever one's religious views and affirmations, if he has any, he cannot penetrate far into the Middle Ages without learning to look with respect and admiration, not unmixed with detestation, perhaps, on the papacy as the institution, as it was conceived, not for the first time, but in its most perfect form, in the imperial brain of Hildebrand, Gregory VII. It was the greatest ideal that a Christian and a statesman ever evolved. He envisaged an empire greater than Alexander or Caesar, Charlemagne or Napoleon, saw even in their wildest dreams of conquest, and his ambition was more rational than theirs, for underneath his project was a principle as nearly deathless as anything human can ever be. His was an ideal perfectly logical, proceeding irresistibly to its conclusions from a few assumed facts. If Christ promised to build his church upon Peter, if he gave to Peter and his successors the keys of heaven and hell, if Peter was the first bishop of Rome and actually transmitted his powers to a successor, then all the rest follows as matter of course. Whoever sits in the chair of Peter is universal father of Christians, which is what Pope means. And all who refuse obedience to him are schismatics, and presumably heretics also. Jesus promised his Holy Spirit to all his followers to lead them into all the truth, and that promise would of course have special force in the case of him to whom the care of all believers was explicitly committed. Feed my sheep. Hence, it is perfectly logical to infer the infallibility of the chief pastor and teacher of Christians when he speaks from the chair of Peter about a matter of faith or morals. Alongside of this vice-gerent of Christ, the medieval world placed another vast conception that long obsessed the minds of men, even though they must have perceived that their theory bore little relation to actual fact. They conceived a universal imperium, or civil power, of equal divine institution and right, and as supreme in its own sphere as the sanctodium, or universal spiritual authority of the Pope. This was the empire, the Holy Roman Empire, as it was grandiloquently termed in things mundane. All men owed obedience to the emperor, even the Pope. In things spiritual, all men owed obedience to the Pope, even the empire. The two realms were different spheres. Pope and empire moved in different planes, and hence the spiritual and the temporal, Pope and empire, could never conflict. The thing was perfectly simple. Had not Jesus said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's"? Caesar was the empire. and the Pope was on earth in God's stead. Two ideals more magnificent have never sprung from the mind of man. They still move our admiration. We still feel their glamour, even though we believe in neither. Why did the world lose faith in them? Because experience taught men that these two enticing theories flatly contradicted the world's well-authenticated stock of fact. Men were pragmatists long before pragmatism. Men have always abandoned theories that will not work, slowly and reluctantly perhaps, but inevitably. Even the medieval world had to recognize, to some extent, the discrepancy between its darling theories and the hard facts of life. The assumption that man's religious obligations could never interfere with his civil, because in theory they moved in different spheres or planes, proved to be at violent variance with fact. Man is not two beings, unto civil and the other spiritual. He is one being. Man does not live two lives, one mundane and the other heavenly. He lives one life. No conflict between the spiritual and the mundane. Life is nothing else than a perpetual conflict between them. The spirit strives against the flesh, and the flesh against the spirit, said Paul, and in so saying he expressed a universal experience. What is civil? What is religious? And who shall determine the boundaries between them? And so medieval history may almost be summed up in a single phrase, a never-ending conflict between Pope and Emperor. There was a reason for this other than the primary one, of theories that together contradicted fact. Neither theory, taken by itself, was in accord with fact. While Pope and Emperor might lay claim to universal authority, each in his own sphere, neither possessed a jurisdiction that the most daring imagination could describe as universal. Fully half of Christendom even then refused to acknowledge the Pope's authority, but resisted it as impugnant usurpation. More than half of Europe refused to acknowledge anything but a titular superiority in the emperor. And over the rest of the world he had, of course, not even the shadow of title to rule. Wherever one turned, men saw their theories in flagrant disagreement with fact. The medieval world was densely ignorant of early Christian history. As men came to know about the beginnings of Christianity, they learned that it is more than doubtful if Peter was the first bishop of Rome. As the New Testament writings were better studied and appreciated, it became evident that Peter had no such supremacy among the apostles as the papal theory requires for its foundation. Where that theory did not contradict fact, it could not be proved to accord with fact. The whole concept was left hanging in the air, with no point of contact with the world of men and events. But most of this knowledge and experience were to come later. Men in the age of Francis possessed neither. These theories were real to them. If any facts seemed to disagree, so much the worse for the facts. The theories were indubitably true. Nobody questioned them. It was in the age of faith, which is to say that it was an age of credulity. The fact above all that it concerns us to know and fully realize is that in these respects Francis was completely the child of his age. His was not a skeptical, inquiring mind. He received with meek docility what he was taught. No doubts disturbed him. His own experience led him to believe much that the church of his day did not teach, some that was incompatible with the church's teaching, but he never perceived the contradiction. He took the church at its own valuation. He practiced the rites in common use, and in his own way found spiritual profit in them. But though he was in the church, he was not of it, and we shall see. It is hard for us to put ourselves in the place of one like Francis, but at least let us not imagine that he was ignorant of the great defects of the church of medieval times. Italians had never had illusion about their church and its head. They have lived too close to it and know it too intimately for that. They are like the employees of a theater who see the play from the back of the stage. All that is beauty and glamour of fairyland to the audience, they see in all its real tardiness and squalor. Yet Italian eyes became so accustomed to what they see that one may doubt if they really see it. Francis was conscious enough of the seemly side of the medieval church, saw the evils clearly enough to revolt against them in feeling, but there was no intellectual revolt. The life of Francis was an attempt at spiritual reformation, because he was chiefly a man of the spirit. If he had been a more intellectual man, if the evils of the church had taken the same hold of his mind that they did of his feelings, he would doubtless have begun a reformation more like that of the 16th century, and as undoubtedly would have failed. The time was not ripe for such a movement. The revolt of Francis was instinctive rather than conscious, automatic more than reasoned. He knew, he must have known, the clergy to be in large part corrupt and impure. He knew that simony was unblushingly practiced, from high to low. He knew that bishops neglected their duties, and that monasteries were decaying of their own luxury and wealth. A contemporary probably did not exaggerate when he said of the officials of the papal court, "They are stones for understanding, wood for justice, fire for wrath, iron for forgiveness, deceitful as foxes, proud as bulls, greedy and insatiable as the Minotaur." It was praised in Eugenius IV as an act of memorable virtue, that when a priest at the beginning of a lawsuit offered him a golden mark, he refused it. One wonders what would have happened had the same pope been offered by the same priest 1,000 golden marks. Nevertheless, popes, bishops, and priests, however unworthy their characters and lives, were believed to hold the keys to heaven and hell. Wicked they might be, but they were still the appointed channels of the grace of God, which could be received only through sacraments of which priests and prelates were the divinely appointed dispensaries. Apart from the church and its sacraments, there was no assurance of salvation. This had been the accepted teaching ever since the time of Cyprian, who wrote about 250 A.D., "The bishop is in the church, and the church is in the bishop. And if anyone is not with the bishop, he is not in the church," and went on to argue elaborately that outside of the church and bishop there are no valid sacraments, and hence no salvation. The church was the ark of salvation. It behooved all men to get into the ark and stay there, if they would make sure of eternal life. Men like Francis, sincere seekers after God, never doubted that they found him through the church and its hierarchy. Though the priest might be despicable as a man when, by virtue of his ordination, he made the body of Christ and offered it on the altar for the sins of the people, he must be respected as the official possessor of supernatural power, and the body thus made must be reverently received by the believer as the chief sustenance of a spiritual life miraculously implanted in the soul by baptism. Nevertheless, there were in the age of Francis ideas of reform, struggles to return to the simplicity of the Gospels and the age of the Apostles, revolt against a church that had been visibly corrupted by wealth and needed the stern discipline of poverty to regain its lost spiritual power. Such ideas were in the air. Francis could not escape learning something about them, though we lack proof that he was much influenced by them. In his own country of Italy, the 12th and 13th centuries were a time of heresy and schisms, none of them originating in subtle theological disputes, but in practical attempts to find a truer way of Christian living. Arnold of Brescia, long before, had summoned bishops and priests and pope to renounce their wealth, to divest themselves of their great estates, to sever their connection with the state, and depend for support on the voluntary offerings of believers. To the wise and prudent of this world, that appeared to be madness. Since the time of Constantine, men had known no way by which the church could be kept alive, save by the support of the civil power. And the rule had always been a good one, too, in the main, that he who pays the piper has the right to call the tune. If the state supported it, might to some extent control. Arnold was burned, and his ashes were cast into the Tiber. His name and influence seemed to have perished with his body. But it was not so. Afterwards, a troublesome heretical heretical sect known as Arnoldists professed to trace their origin to him and his teachings, but later most of them were absorbed into the poor men of Lyons of Waldness. It is worthwhile to recall the origin of this heresy, the most troublesome that the medieval church was plagued with, because we shall find the life of Francis parallel with that of its founder, up to the crisis in each. As the story is told us by Catholic writers, the Waldenists themselves have no literature about their origin. One Peter Waldo was a wealthy merchant of Lyons about 1145. At a banquet, one of his friends was struck dead at his side, probably by an attack of apoplexy, and this naturally made him think seriously about his own spiritual condition. He had been living a worldly life, and it is hinted that he had not been over-scrupulous in business, which is not difficult to believe. The teaching of the Church was that such a man, if he died suddenly without the last rites of the Church and absolution for his mortal sins, would go straight to hell, or, at the very least, to a long stay in purgatory. Waldo sought his priest's advice, and was told in the words of Jesus to the rich young ruler, "If thou wouldst be perfect, sell all that thou hast and give to the poor, and come follow me." The Church taught this in a way of perfection, but ecclesiastics had no idea of following it themselves, and little hope that others would follow. But Waldo was not sufficiently learned to make the subtle distinction by which priests excused themselves from obeying what they officially taught as a divine command. But he took the words literally, and he literally obeyed. He then hired 2 priests to translate the Gospels into the vernacular of his region, committed large parts of them to memory, and went about teaching them to others. In a few years he had quite a following, who did likewise. They adopted a life of poverty, wore sandals and a plain robe, but were neither monks nor priests. They had no quarrel with the church in which they had been bred. They wished only to make known to others this new way of life in which they had found peace and joy. The Roman Church has always looked with suspicion on such bands of laymen and their labors. They are, of course, always potential scholars of heresy. So its policy has been neither to suppress them or control them, the former usually as the easier course. This was what the Archbishop of Lyons attempted in the case of Waldo and his followers. He commanded them to cease their work and let the priests, the authorized agents of the church, do the teaching. Accordingly, Waldo and some others made a pilgrimage to Rome to lay their case before the Pope and seek his approbation. As their luck would have it, the third Lateran Council was in session when they arrived at Rome in 1179. In a pontificate of Alexander III, the Pope is said to have received the delegation honorably. Waldo was by this time venerable in appearance and made a good impression on all. The Pope kissed him on the cheek and turned him over to the council for examination. Walter Map of Mapes, an Englishman who was present, was appointed to conduct the examination and ask subtle theological questions. The naive replies of these untrained men made the assembled prelates and theologians laugh, and the upshot was that they were dismissed and told by the Pope to return home and obey their archbishop. They then had to consider, as they put it, whether they would obey God or man, and after a brief hesitation resumed their work, which speedily procured them excommunication from the church. Thus rose the dangerous and persistent heresy. There were many Waldenesses in Italy, especially in the northern parts, during the career of Francis. He may easily have known something about them. He may even have derived from that source some of the ideas that determined his own life. This is quite immaterial, for in Appy case, the facts of similarity between Waldo and Francis are as indisputable as they are striking. The poor men of Lyons were the best known of many sects that all sprung from the same root, the corruptions and spiritual death of the medieval church. Many scholars have wasted valuable time and paper in the attempt to trace out some tactile relation between these sects, to establish some apostolic succession of heresy in place of the apostolic succession claimed by the Catholic Church. It is vain labor and worthless as well. The proofs they seek would have little significance if found. A much easier solution of the problem is also more valuable. Similar causes produce similar results. This is certainly true, even if it be true, as many maintain, that history never repeats itself. During the centuries preceding the Renaissance, we find centuries of revolt against the Church in every country of Europe, because the Church was the same vile thing in every country. Francis undoubtedly knew some of these facts, but was not influenced by them. He cared nothing for reform in the usual sense. He cared nothing for theology. He cared nothing for rights. He was greatly interested in folks, and he was passionately concerned about life. And there we find the key that unlocks his mystery. And I think we'll end there for the first chapter of Life of Francis of Assisi, Little Blue Book number 765, written by Henry C. Vedder, copyrighted 1925. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in part 2.